An old dusty revolver revealed buried secrets of a past everyone wanted to forget. When the bullets of truth hit the heart of that small town, no one was left unscathed. A story where justice and revenge ride side by side in the plains of the Wild West. Prepare for a journey that will brand your soul like red-hot iron. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment from which state you follow this saga of redemption. At the break of dawn, when the wind whispered forgotten promises on the dunes and the dust danced like golden ghosts under the first rays of sun, the village of Dry Peaks awoke. It wasn't a vibrant awakening, but a slow shuffle of feet and the opening of creaking doors against the heat that promised to be relentless. The sun on the plains of the deep plains didn't ask permission. It imposed itself, beating like an invisible hammer on the parched earth and on the wide-brimmed hat of John, the blacksmith. John was the silent core of the village. His hands, thick and calloused from the daily work with incandescent iron, possessed a dexterity that seemed disproportionate to his robust appearance. He could shape a perfect horseshoe with the same ease with which he fixed a rancher's plow or forged the most delicate piece for machinery. But the forge didn't just temper metal. It also seemed to keep the fire in his own chest under control. The aftermath of a past he kept under lock and key, buried under layers of dust and hard work. There was a broken promise somewhere in time, a failure that haunted him like the shadow of a vulture on a clear day. This promise was the weight he carried, an ember that never died under the ashes of his quiet existence. Life in Dry Peaks followed the slow, relentless rhythm of nature. The creek, a thread of life in the valley, dictated how generous the land would be. The saloon, with its swinging doors and the smell of old wood, sweat, and cheap liquor, was the meeting point where news, rumors, and loneliness mingled. It was there that Manuel, the owner of the general store, spent his nights, a gray-haired man with eyes that had seen much, but who now only wanted peace. He extended credit in lean times, listened to confessions, and kept secrets, maintaining a sense of order in that small universe of dust and deferred dreams. His motivation was simple and profound: to protect that place that had become his refuge. The arrival of Anne subtly changed the village's dynamic. A young woman with medical knowledge that seemed like a miracle to many, she settled in a room at the back of Manuel's general store. Initial skepticism gave way to cautious respect as her cures proved effective. Her case of polished instruments and the diary where she recorded medicinal plants from the surrounding area were her silent weapons against illness and ignorance. Anne carried the silent burden of honoring her mentor's memory, and perhaps more, deeply, proving to herself that she could heal where others had failed. There was a slight melancholy in her eyes, an echo of past losses that propelled her forward. The monotony of Dry Peaks began to break with the arrival of riders who didn't seem to belong to those landscapes. They were men in suits, with a city air and official papers. They spoke of progress, of a glorious future for the valley, of a railroad that would connect Dry Peaks to the world. They represented the United Western Railroad Company, led in those lands by a soft-spoken man with a calculating gaze named Dr. Elias. They weren't bandits, but their presence exuded a different threat, one disguised as opportunity. They began to map, to ask questions, to promise a future that for some sounded like music and for others like an omen. The wind, which had only whispered before, now carried the echo of distant machines and the anxiety of the unknown. The rustling of the company's papers was a strange and discordant sound in the valley's usual silence. John felt the cold metal of suspicion tighten in his chest. He watched the men in suits from the door of his workshop, noticing how their eyes didn't see the harsh beauty of the land or the honest sweat of the ranchers, but only numbers and roots. Those papers, signed with dark, elegant ink, seemed to carry the smell of old betrayals. The United Western Railroad Company didn't offer partnership. It offered submission disguised as prosperity. John's eyes, accustomed to seeing the truth of metal under the forge's heat, saw the polished falsehood in the newcomer's words and smiles. He felt that those men were like vultures circling a carcass, ready to seize what they considered theirs by right. Their presence was a scratch on the village's soul, a harbinger of pain. One afternoon, the sky, which had been relentlessly blue, began to darken in shades of lead. A strong wind whipped the dust into furious whirlwinds, and in minutes, a storm broke over dry peaks with the fury of a cornered animal. Lightning tore through the sky and the rain fell like water bullets. Anne, returning from attending a distant family whose child had a fever, was caught by surprise on the way. Her wagon got stuck in the mud, and the only option was to seek shelter. She spotted the faint light of John's forge, a beacon in the turbulent darkness. He sheltered her in his workshop. The smell of hot iron, coal, and oil mingled with the damp smell of rain and stirred earth. Sitting near the forge, which still radiated a comforting warmth, they shared strong tea and the silence that only exists between people who feel comfortable in each other's presence. They talked about simple things: the excessive heat, the need for rain, the harshness of life on the frontier. John observed the precision with which Anne held the cup, the delicacy of her hands that, nevertheless, treated wounds and delivered babies with firmness. He saw in her a quiet strength that reminded him of steel, bendable in fire, but unbreakable after tempering. It was a moment of calm in the eye of the storm, a first glimpse of connection that went beyond politeness. The sound of the rain beating incessantly on the workshop roof created a kind of cocoon, an intimate space where the outside world seemed less threatening. Anne felt an unexpected safety in John's silent presence. He didn't ask questions, just offered shelter and warmth. The outsiders, indifferent to the rhythm of nature, continued their activities. Dr. Elias and his men organized meetings in the saloon, unrolling large maps on the card tables and speaking loudly about the train station, the telegraph that would bring news from the world instantly, the prosperity that the railroad would pour into the village like a river of gold. The eyes of some residents, especially the younger ones who dreamed of a life beyond the dust, shone with the promise. The saloon owner, who saw the possibility of more customers and more money, was one of the most enthusiastic. But Manuel, with the wisdom of years, frowned. Changes that were too fast, he said, usually brought more problems than solutions. The outsider's haste was a subtle poison, corroding the village's tranquility. While fixing a wheel on one of the outsider's wagons, a job ordered with a tone of service for future progress, John found documents that had fallen and were partially hidden under the seat. They were blueprints and reports that spoke of something much larger than a simple station. There was mention of a dam, a significant diversion of the creek, and maps showing a vast area that would be submerged. John's heart froze upon recognizing natural landmarks in the area marked for flooding. It included not only fertile lands that supported several families, but also the small pioneer cemetery, where the first pioneers, including some of his few friends, were buried. The railroad was just the bait. The real prize was the water and the land beneath it. The sight of the dam on the map looked like a hideous scar on the land's skin. John's suspicion turned into bitter certainty. Those men weren't visionaries of progress. They were looters in suits. Anne, on her wanderings through the hills in search of medicinal plants, especially one she believed effective against the fever that stubbornly kept appearing in the village, found something disturbing. Fresh marks on trees, stakes driven into the ground in unnatural patterns, small piles of stones that seemed to delineate something. She was on land she believed to be communal, used by shepherds for cattle. The markings, however, indicated a property demarcation. Someone was acting in the shadows, claiming territory without the community's knowledge. Her search for a cure had led her to discover the first symptoms of the disease afflicting the land itself. The tension began to manifest in subtle but noticeable ways. The outsiders, seeing that not everyone was buying their promises of gold, began to exert pressure. More distant ranchers, whose lands were directly in the path of the flooding and creek diversion plans, reported threatening visits, laughable purchase offers disguised as generous deals. Fear began to circulate like the cold wind of an unexpected winter. John heard the stories, saw the nervousness on familiar faces, and the ember in his chest threatened to ignite again. He recognized that pattern. It was the same tactic he had seen on other frontiers, the same heavy hand of civilization crushing simple life. A turning point struck directly at the heart of the village. Manuel, the owner of the general store, suffered a serious accident. His wagon, heavy with supplies, lost a wheel on a steep slope, overturning and leaving him severely injured. It was Anne who attended to him, demonstrating impressive calm and skill under pressure. She managed to stop the bleeding and immobilize his injuries, saving his life. But Manuel was temporarily incapacitated, his leg broken and several ribs fractured. The village felt the jolt. Manuel was the anchor, the information hub, and the safety net of the community. John went to help clear the wreckage of Manuel's wagon. He examined the broken axles, the splintered wood. As a blacksmith, he understood the mechanics, the point of failure. And then he saw it. It wasn't just wear or bad luck. There was a precise cut in the wood of the axle, intentionally made to weaken it and ensure it would break under weight and pressure at an opportune and dangerous moment. Manuel's accident had not been an accident. It was sabotage. The realization hit him like a hammer blow. The threat was no longer veiled. It was direct and cruel. The United Western Railroad Company was willing to use violence. The thought of Manuel, the kind and peaceful man, being targeted by such cowardice filled him with a cold and controlled rage. He kept the broken piece, the silent proof of murderous intent. The line had been crossed. During the annual harvest celebration, one of the few moments the village allowed itself to forget the hardships and celebrate the land's generosity, the community gathered. There was simple music, abundant food, and the genuine joy of being together. John, who rarely participated in festivities, surprised everyone, especially Anne. He sought her out while she was looking after some children playing nearby. In his calloused hands, he held a small case of polished wood. Inside, there was a set of instruments he had forged: delicate tweezers, a small spatula, a miniature scalpel, tools for her precise work, made with the same attention to detail. He dedicated to forging horseshoes for racehorses. They were sturdy, built to last, but with a subtle elegance. "For your hands," he said, his voice low, not seeking attention. Anne took the case, feeling the solid weight of the wood and metal. The gesture moved her deeply. It wasn't just a gift. It was a recognition of her work, her skill, her presence in that community that still regarded her with some reserve. It was the forge and the healing, iron and flesh, finding a point of union. It was a crucial moment, a silent and deep bond being forged between them under the vast, starry night sky. She smiled at him, a smile that reached her eyes. He felt a different kind of heat than the forge in his chest. Faith, which he thought he had abandoned long ago, seemed to light a small flame. The tension continued to rise. The outsiders increased the pressure, now openly threatening those who refused to sell their land. They hired henchmen, rough-looking, men who patrolled the roads leading to the village. The air grew heavy, laden with fear and uncertainty. The community, once united by necessity, began to divide under the weight of promises and threats. Some argued that resisting progress was futile. Others, stubborn as the land itself, clung to their history and the tomb of their ancestors. A town meeting was called in the small church of the village. The floorboards creaked under the weight of tense bodies. The midday heat poured through, the narrow windows mixing with the dust suspended in the air. Dr. Elias and his men presented the documents, spoke again of the glorious future, the inevitability of progress. They offered compensation, mere scraps for the ranchers who would lose their land. The blacksmith John remained silent in a corner, observing not the speakers, but the faces of his neighbors, the doubt, fear, and anger contained in their eyes. He was like a mountain lion lurking, studying every movement, every nuance. After the meeting, the village fell silent, a heavy silence of uncertainty. Anne sought out John in the workshop. The faint light of a lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls full of tools. She took a deep breath and spoke. She told him about her father. He had been a railroad engineer, a brilliant man who loved his work, but who remained silent when the company he worked for many years ago decided to flood an entire valley, to build a dam, displacing an indigenous village and destroying their way of life. The weight of that silent tragedy haunted her father for the rest of his life, and she saw history repeating itself in Dry Peaks now. She felt the echo of her father's pain and her own anxieties. The weight of that shared history under the faint lamplight brought them closer in an unexpected way. It was a demonstration of mutual vulnerability, a revelation of old scars that found resonance in each other. Faith in humanity, shaken by the company's actions, found a little solace in the mutual trust that was growing. Events escalated when the first team of railroad workers arrived. There were dozens of men, noisy and full of equipment. They set up a camp on the banks of the creek, the same one the company planned to divert and dam. They brought pickaxes, shovels, wheelbarrows, and most worryingly, boxes of dynamite to blast a path through the rocks in the hills. The promise was easy, money for anyone willing to work on the construction. A new division forming in the village between those who needed the money and those who distrusted the source. John watched the camp, and then he saw it. Among the workers leading a demolition team was a familiar face, a man named Roderick. John had known him on another frontier, in other times when their lives were very different. Roderick wasn't an enemy, but he knew part of John's secret, a piece of his past that he kept hidden. Roderick's presence there wasn't a mere coincidence. The world seemed to shrink, bringing John's past directly into the uncertain future of Dry Peaks. It was another complication, another obstacle in the path of the peace he so desperately sought. The light of the past seemed to focus directly on him. One night, the wind, blowing strong from the hills, carried the smell of smoke. A mysterious fire broke out in the workers' camp. Tents caught fire. Supply boxes were consumed by the flames. There was panic, shouts, and running. The entire village mobilized to help. The doctor, Anne, ran to the camp to treat the injured, who fortunately were not many, mostly with minor burns or injuries caused by the confusion. John and other men from the village helped control the flames, working exhaustively to prevent the fire from spreading to the nearby woods, which would have been catastrophic. The smell of burned wood and scorched fabric hung in the air. No one said it openly, but many suspected the fire was the work of local saboteurs, perhaps desperate ranchers. In the midst of the chaos of the fire, while helping remove supplies, from the burning tents, Anne found something that escaped the attention of others. Documents, partially burned, crumpled, and smudged with soot. They were more detailed blueprints of the dam project and the creek diversion. But there was something else. Internal communication notes from the company. They spoke of the difficulty in negotiating with the residents, the need to incentivize displacement, and in one of the notes, a phrase that chilled Anne's blood. The fire will serve as justification for the need for reinforced security at the site. Request the immediate dispatch of more armed men. The fire was not sabotaged by the residents. It had been orchestrated by the company's own men, an act of self-sabotage to create a pretext for bringing in armed men and increasing pressure on the village. The realization was a punch to the gut. John and Anne, working separately and sharing their discoveries in furtive, anxious conversations in the dead of night, pieced things together. Manuel's accident, the fire at the camp, it was all part of a larger, more sinister plan. The United Western Railroad Company wouldn't wait for negotiations. They were building their way by force, removing human and natural obstacles. The truth was like a wild animal they had accidentally unleashed. Faith in negotiation and dialogue was fading. Hope seemed like a grain of sand being carried away by the wind of greed. Roderick, the man from John's past, approached him days after the fire. Not as a company henchman, but with the uncomfortable familiarity of someone who shares a history. Roderick had changed. Time and perhaps life on the frontier had hardened him. He didn't threaten, but he made it clear that he knew who John was, what he had done, and that the secret could be revealed. He was there serving the company, following orders, but there was a hesitation in his gaze, a remnant of the man John had known. Roderick was a tangible reminder of the past John tried so hard to keep buried, a human obstacle with the power to destroy the life he had built. John knew he needed to deal with Roderick before his secret became a weapon in the company's hands. "You are Armed men arrived, as promised in the burned documents. They didn't settle in the camp, but on the outskirts of the village, patrolling the roads, making shows of force. They were tough men, with scars and empty eyes, hired by the company to impose its will. The atmosphere in Dry Peaks became oppressive. The air, once vibrant with the sounds of life, now seemed quiet, heavy with latent threat. Children stopped playing in the streets. The ranchers stopped bringing their produce to sell at the general store. Life in the village froze. The moment of greatest danger was approaching. Dr. Elias called a new town meeting, this time in the church. The notice was peremptory. All heads of household were to attend to sign the final documents ceding their lands. This time there would be no negotiation, only imposition. The entire village felt it was the point of no return. The meeting was a trap, a final act of coercion. The hope for a peaceful solution, already fragile, shattered. It was like watching a hurricane forming on the horizon, knowing there was nowhere to run. Shortly before the scheduled time for the town meeting, Anne sought out John in the workshop. The forge was cold, a premonition of the quietness hanging over the village. She was pale, but her eyes shone with a determination John admired. "We can't go there without a plan," she said, her voice firm. "They are armed. It's an ambush." John agreed. He knew. His past had taught him to recognize the signs of an imminent confrontation, the smell of gunpowder in the air even before the first shot. They discussed, their voices low so as not to be overheard. John revealed more of his past to her. Not everything, but enough to explain why he knew so much about that kind of man and that kind of situation. He told her about a time when his hands didn't just shape iron, but also handled weapons. A time of conflict and difficult decisions that culminated in a broken promise that haunted him. Anne listened attentively, without judgment, seeing the pain in his eyes. This sharing deepened their connection, solidifying trust. They were no longer alone in the fight. As they prepared to go to the church, aware of the danger, Manuel, still with his leg immobilized but his spirit intact, called them over. There was an object in his wrinkled hands, an old revolver, dusty and seemingly rusted, the same one mentioned in the introduction. "It belonged to my father," Manuel said. "I haven't touched it in years, but perhaps today it needs to see the light again." John took the gun. It was heavy, balanced. His gaze lingered on it for a moment. The external rust hid the well-maintained steel inside. It wasn't a coincidence, it was destiny offering a tool, a symbol of the past that could forge the future. John knew how to use that tool. He quickly cleaned it, checked the cylinder. It was loaded. The coldness of the metal in his hands brought back dormant memories, a skill he hoped he would never need to use again. They arrived at the church. The scene was exactly as they feared. The company's armed riders surrounded the building, their weapons drawn. Inside, Dr. Elias and his men were at the front, with the documents spread on a makeshift table. The residents were cornered, fear etched on their faces. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The silence was broken only by the creaking of the floorboards and the occasional sound of a nervous cough. The air smelled of fear and dust. The light entering through the windows seemed pale and insufficient. It was the decisive moment, the turning point that would seal the fate of Dry Peaks. Faith and hope seemed to hang by a thread. Dr. Elias spoke, his voice echoing in the tense quiet. He repeated the empty promises, disguised as opportunity. "9. The documents, residents," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Progress doesn't wait. Those who resist will be left behind." His men tightened the circle around the church, their rifles raised. It was a clear show of force, a final imposition. The community seemed on the verge of yielding, crushed by the pressure. Fear was a wild animal ready to devour them. It was then that John, with Anne by his side, stepped forward. His voice, usually low, resonated through the church with a force that surprised many. "We will not sign," he said, simple and direct. "We know what you plan. The dam, the creek diversion, the flooding of the lands, the destruction of the cemetery. We know Manuel's accident was sabotage. We know you set fire to your own camp." John's words fell like heavy stones. Dr. Elias's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of contained rage. "Who do you think you are, blacksmith?" Elias hissed. "Just a man dirty with coal sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." John took another step forward, his hand on the old revolver Manuel had given him. The cold metal was a reminder of what he was capable of. "I am a man who is tired of seeing people like you destroy lives in the name of progress," John replied. His gaze met Roderick's, who was among the armed men. Roderick looked away, his hesitation visible. "And I know you, Roderick. Don't want to be part of this. You know who I am. You know what I can do." The mention of Roderick and the veiled threat destabilized the henchmen's formation. Some looked at Roderick, others at John. The air grew even, more tense, a premonition of imminent conflict, death hovering like a hungry vulture. Anne, seeing the opportunity, also spoke. "I have proof," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Documents that show your plans, and that the fire was planned by you. If anything happens to us, these documents will be revealed." She pulled out the partially burned papers, holding them up so they could be seen. Her words increased the uncertainty among the armed men and the indignation of the residents. Hope ignited in the eyes of some. Dr. Elias realized that the situation was getting out of control. He gestured to his men, a silent command to advance. The henchmen hesitated for a second, but began to close the circle, their rifles pointed at the residents. It was the crucial moment, the split second that would decide everything. It was then that Manuel's old revolver in John's hand acted, not with a shot, but with a quick, precise movement. John aimed and fired not at Elias or his men, but at a support beam on the church porch. The wood splintered, and part of the roof collapsed with a deafening crash, raising a cloud of dust and startling the henchmen's horses. It was a calculated shot, a warning not to kill, but to unbalance, to show that he didn't hesitate to use force, and that he was dangerously accurate. The skill he had buried was back, sharp as the steel he shaped. Confusion spread. The horses neighed and bolted. The armed men dispersed momentarily, some trying to control their animals, others shielding themselves from the dust and debris. Dr. Elias shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. At that moment, some residents, inspired by John's boldness and armed with farm tools, pitchforks, shovels, axes, moved. They weren't warriors, but they were defending their homes. Manuel, despite his broken leg, picked up an old rifle leaning against the church wall and raised it with trembling hands, a symbol of resistance. The community's faith in itself, fueled by the courage of a few, was reborn. The fight began. It wasn't an organized battle, but a series of chaotic skirmishes inside and around the church. John, using his skill with the weapon, disarmed henchmen with precise shots that hit hands or guns, with no intention to kill, only to neutralize the immediate threat. He moved with the agility of an experienced wolf, using the dust and debris as cover. Anne, meanwhile, attended to the wounded, residents and even some henchmen hit by mistake in the confusion. Her calm, healing presence was a counterpoint to the violence. Roderick, instead of fighting John, fired into the air, a gesture of refusal to participate in that massacre. He knew John was not an enemy to be underestimated, and perhaps there was a shred of honor left in him. "It's over, Elias," Roderick shouted. "I won't kill these people for your profits." The unexpected resistance of the residents, John's skill, Roderick's defection, and the proof from Anne's documents turned the tide. Dr. Elias and his men, who expected an easy surrender, found themselves outnumbered and disorganized. The prospect of a bloodbath in a church, with witnesses and incriminating evidence, was not something the company desired. In a final act of desperation, Dr. Elias tried to grab Anne, perhaps to use her as a hostage or destroy the documents. But John was faster. He intercepted Elias and the two faced off. It wasn't a gunfight, but a raw, dirty confrontation. Elias's brute strength against John's skill and contained rage. Dust rose with their movements. John, with a well-aimed blow, using the butt of the revolver, knocked Elias down, and he fell unconscious. With their leader defeated and Roderick refusing to fight, the remaining henchmen retreated. Some fled on horseback, others simply dropped their weapons. The United Western Railroad Company was driven out of Dry Peaks, their attempt at imposition thwarted by a community's faith in defending itself and the courage of a few individuals. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't a silence of fear, but of exhaustion and relief. The dust settled slowly. The residents looked at each other, some injured, but all alive, hope reborn in their eyes. Manuel, leaning on his old rifle, looked at John and Anne. "You saved the village," he said, his voice hoarse. John merely nodded, the revolver still in his hand, the weight of past and present mingling. John's secret, that he wasn't just a blacksmith but a man with a violent past and dangerous skills, wasn't fully revealed in words, but was seen in his actions. And the community, which had previously seen him only as the silent blacksmith, now saw him as their silent guardian. His vulnerability was exposed, that of a man who tried to bury his nature, but who embraced it when necessary to protect those he loved. The cost was the loss of his anonymity, the quietness of his new life. But the victory was the survival of the village and the tacit acceptance of who he truly was. In the days that followed, the village began to heal. Anne cared for the wounded, restoring health and hope with her skilled hands. The diary of medicinal plants was used to heal not just bodies, but also the community's wounded spirit. Manuel recovered slowly, overseeing the reconstruction of the damaged parts of the church and the camp. Roderick, instead of fleeing, decided to stay. He offered his help in the reconstruction, a gesture of redemption. He and John had a long conversation. The past was confronted. Old scores were settled not with bullets but with words and a mutual understanding of the harsh choices the frontier imposed. Roderick became an accepted member of the community, his story intertwining with theirs. The romance between John and Anne, forged under pressure and danger, flourished in the calm that followed. The 5 crucial moments, the shelter in the storm, the hand-forged gift, the confession about her father, the collaboration in the crisis, the act of mutual courage, built a solid foundation. They shared not only the future of Dry Peaks but also an understanding of the shadows each carried. On a clear night, sitting under the starry sky, Anne placed her hand over John's, feeling the roughness of the calluses. "Your past doesn't define you, John," she said softly. "It's your actions that define who you are." And he, looking at her, saw the light in her eyes and knew he had found his home, not in a place, but in a person. Faith and hope weren't just words, they were the hand he held. Dry Peaks rebuilt itself, stronger and more united by adversity. The United Western Railroad Company did not return. News of what happened spread, and other communities on the planned route were put on alert. The threat of relentless progress diminished, at least for now. Life returned to its rhythm, but with a new layer of resilience. The creek continued to run free, watering the lands that sustained life. The cemetery remained untouched, a testament to the history and memory that the community refused to drown. John continued to be the blacksmith, but now he was also the man who defended them, the silent guardian. He still carried the weight of his broken promise, but the ember was no longer just regret. It was also the memory of a sacrifice that was worth it. Anne continued to be the doctor, healing with her hands and her knowledge, a source of light and hope. Manuel's old revolver was cleaned, put away, not as a trophy of violence, but as a reminder of what was needed to preserve peace, an object that connected the past, present, and future. It was a relic of a time that refused to die completely. The dust still rose on the plains, the sun still beat down mercilessly, the wind still whispered. But now, in Dry Peaks, the whisper seemed to speak not of forgotten promises, but of a hard-won hope, of unwavering faith in human capacity to fight for what is right. Land and man had fought a battle and, for now, had won. The wild animal within them, courage, determination, the instinct to protect, had risen to face the animal of greed. And you, at what moment will you let hope bloom in your desert?